wore the guard's uniform. He didn't realize he'd just ruined his life. He thought it was just a joke. A drunk American tourist, Rick Dalton, stood before one of Britain's most disciplined soldiers and did the unthinkable. He tore the royal uniform. He spat in the guard's face, and he laughed. But what he didn't know is that he had just crossed a line that centuries of tradition had drawn in stone, because standing behind that silence was not weakness, but a system, one that doesn't shout, it responds. In the next few minutes, you'll witness a downfall so precise, so devastating, it turned one man's arrogance into an international scandal and left him sitting alone, jobless, exiled, and forgotten in a prison cell. But this story isn't just about Rick. It's about honor. It's about silence. And it's about what happens when you mistake stillness for surrender. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story might just hit even harder. It was a night soaked in mist and mystery. London didn't just look old that evening. It felt ancient. The fog curled between lampposts like silent ghosts, wrapping itself around the weathered stone walls of Buckingham Palace. The cobblestones were slick, glistening under faint golden light, and the air hung heavy with dampness and quiet reverence. But not for Rick Dalton. Rick, a 48-year-old Texan from Dallas, had arrived in London that morning with swagger in his step and bourbon in his veins. He was the kind of man who didn't whisper in sacred places. He laughed loud. He moved big. And tonight, with a flask of Tennessee whiskey tucked in the pocket of his leather jacket, he had already crossed the line from tipsy to dangerous. He was a tourist, yes, but the kind who thought money could buy charm, and attitude could replace respect. As he wandered near the palace gates, his cowboy boots thumped unevenly on the stone. Every few steps he'd trip a little, laugh to himself, and keep going. He didn't notice the solemnity of the place. He didn't feel the centuries pressing in around him. All he saw were uniforms, tourists, and a good story to bring back home. And then he saw him, standing like a statue, eyes forward, unmoved by time or taunt. Private First Class Aaron Fletcher. Just 25 years old, but his back was straight as steel. His tall frame filled out the iconic red uniform of the Queen's Guard, and his bearskin hat rose above his head like a silent warning. To Rick, though, Aaron wasn't a symbol of duty or honor. He was just a challenge. Rick paused, swaying slightly. He took a long look at the guard. Then, with a crooked grin, he slurred, "Hey, G.I. Joe." There was no response. Aaron didn't blink. He didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. And that silence, it only emboldened Rick. He staggered forward, raising his voice. "What's the matter?" "Cat got your tongue?" Nearby, tourists started to glance over. A few pulled out their phones. Rick took another step. His boot scraped loudly on the stone, echoing across the fog. "Bet you're not even allowed to smile, huh? Standing there like a doll in a toy shop." Still, nothing from Aaron. But inside the guard's chest, something tightened. A flicker of warning. A pressure, low and sharp, like the moment before a storm. And yet, he stood firm. That was his job. But Rick didn't see duty. He saw a wall to push, a game to win, and he was just getting started. But Rick wasn't just drunk. He was restless, and the silence of the guard only fueled the fire he carried under his denim collar. After all, back in Texas, silence was rare. Everything came with a laugh, a story, or a fight. So this man, this immovable figure in red, felt like an insult to everything Rick thought made a man a man. To him, Aaron Fletcher wasn't a soldier. He was a mannequin in a stiff costume, and tonight, Rick decided he would be the one to break him. The crowd was still thin, a mix of couples and late-night wanderers, their voices hushed by the weight of the fog. Some had begun to notice the Texan circling the guard like a dog around a tethered bull. One woman whispered to her partner. A man raised his phone, unsure whether he should film or intervene. And then, Rick reached out, not with the reverence of a curious tourist, but with the smug confidence of someone who believed rules didn't apply to him. His fingers brushed the crimson fabric of Aaron's uniform, felt the tautness of regulation-pressed wool, then tugged. Once, twice, harder each time, like a child yanking at a curtain. "You really just gonna stand there?" he sneered, his southern drawl thickened by alcohol. "Come on, say something. Show me there's a real man under that hat." Aaron didn't move. But his breath caught, his pulse quickened, and somewhere behind that blank stare, his mind raced with every protocol drilled into him during endless weeks of training. Do not react, do not speak, do not engage. But even the most seasoned soldier is still flesh and bone, and disrespect, when it slices too deep, begins to bleed. Rick leaned in closer. The whiskey on his breath now blended with damp London air, sour and reckless. "I bet you hate this job, huh?" he said with a smirk. "Just another cog in the Queen's little fairy tale. Still, nothing." But Rick wasn't looking for a response anymore. He was looking for a reaction, and he got one, not from Aaron, but from the crowd. A gasp broke the air as Rick gave the fabric one final yank, and the uniform tore. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, like a flag being ripped down in a storm. And for a second, the entire square went still. Rick, grinning like a schoolyard bully, held up the torn strip like a prize. "You see this?" he barked. "This is what I think of your little circus." Aaron remained motionless, but inside him a line had been crossed, not just a physical boundary, but a sacred one. The uniform wasn't just clothing. It was centuries of tradition. It was loyalty, discipline, and national pride woven into red thread. And now, in front of rolling cameras and frozen tourists, it had been defiled. He didn't blink. He didn't move. But something in the air shifted. Something dangerous. And Rick Dalton had no idea what was coming next. What happened next didn't feel real. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to freeze, as if London, in all its centuries of glory and grief, was holding its breath. The torn fabric fluttered in Rick's hand, a piece of history disgraced and dangling like some drunken trophy. The laughter that had once bubbled in his throat began to fade, but his pride wouldn't let him stop. Not yet. Aaron Fletcher stood still, but he wasn't calm. Inside, a war was being fought, one not of fists, but of restraint. The rules of his duty echoed in his head like drums. Hold the line. Do not engage. Do not give them what they want. But Aaron wasn't just a man in a uniform. He was a soldier. A human being. And Rick hadn't just ripped cloth. He had torn at identity, insulted honor, spat in the face of legacy. And yet, Aaron didn't move. That silence, once misinterpreted as weakness, now took on a different shape. It became tension, heavy, electric, and sharp, like glass underfoot. It was no longer about pride, it was about containment. He was a grenade with the pin halfway pulled, and Rick, still smirking, didn't even realize it. But then, he crossed the final line. With the confidence of a man who thought the world was his barroom, Rick stumbled one step forward, leaned in, and spat directly into Aaron's face. The crowd gasped. Not loudly, not collectively, but in stunned individual gasps, like air being stolen from 100 lungs at once. And still, Aaron didn't move. But something shifted. Not in him, in the atmosphere. Because some violations aren't just personal. They awaken something larger, something systemic, ancient and watching. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, intentional. From across the mist-veiled square, a new presence approached. One that even Rick's alcohol-numbed mind couldn't ignore. His head turned. The crowd parted. Silence widened like a curtain, and through it stepped a figure forged not in anger, but in authority. Captain Jonathan Mercer. 6'1", graying at the temples, his medals glinting beneath his tailored coat. A man who had led troops through real battlefields and now walked as if this cobbled square was one. Every step announced purpose. Every breath carried command, and as his steel-gray eyes landed on Rick Dalton, the air itself seemed to recoil. Rick scoffed at first, drunken arrogance still clinging to him like smoke. "Who the hell are you?" But the question was wrong. The moment didn't belong to Rick anymore. It belonged to Mercer. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply stopped, studied the scene. Aaron's soaked face, the torn uniform, the trembling crowd, and asked, in a voice so calm it was terrifying, "Do you have any idea who you just insulted?" Rick blinked. His grin faltered. The chill of the London fog finally touched his skin, because for the first time all night he wasn't in control. And as Captain Mercer stepped closer, with discipline in his bones and history behind his shoulders, Rick Dalton began to understand. This wasn't going to end with a warning. It was only just beginning. The silence that followed was not empty. It was judgment. Captain Jonathan Mercer stood inches from Rick Dalton, his posture rigid, his eyes cold and unblinking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The weight of his presence said what words couldn't. Rick, for the first time that evening, shifted uncomfortably. Moments earlier he had been laughing, boasting, tearing at tradition like it was a joke. Now that same square that echoed with his arrogance felt like a courtroom, and Mercer was the judge. "You've made a grave mistake," Mercer said, voice low but precise, like a blade drawn slowly. Rick blinked, the whiskey haze thinning just enough for a seed of doubt to settle in. His grin faltered. "Come on, it's just a joke. Lighten up." But Mercer wasn't moved. This wasn't about a joke. This was about respect. The captain turned slightly, nodding toward Aaron, still standing at attention, his jaw locked, the spit drying on his face like a scar. "Go inside, soldier," Mercer ordered. "I'll handle this." Aaron hesitated for a second, just long enough for the crowd to glimpse the fire burning behind his eyes. Then, with military precision, he turned and walked away. But his clenched fists, trembling slightly at his sides, told the story. This had hurt deeper than flesh. And now, Mercer turned back to Rick. The crowd remained frozen, tourists still filming, still watching, unsure if they were witnessing history or tragedy. And Rick, no longer the confident cowboy, stood alone in the middle. "This isn't a circus," Mercer began, his voice calm but deliberate. "This isn't some royal cosplay for tourists. That man," he nodded toward the direction Aaron had exited, "took an oath to stand between chaos and the crown. And you just spat in his face." Rick opened his mouth, but no words came. Mercer stepped closer. "You didn't insult a man tonight. You insulted everything he represents, the uniform, the flag, the service, the discipline, and now," he paused. "Let the silence do the talking. You've made your life far harder than it ever had to be." Those words hit harder than any punch, because they didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like a promise. Rick tried to laugh it off again, a nervous chuckle bubbling up, but it died in his throat. There was no escaping the truth anymore. He hadn't just embarrassed himself, he had triggered an institution. And institutions have very long memories. In the shadows of Buckingham Palace, under the eye of a nation and the lenses of the world, Rick Dalton had gone too far. And Mercer, with the discipline of a soldier and the precision of a scalpel, was about to show him what consequences look like. In a land where honor still matters, and silence can roar louder than rage. Because in this part of the world, respect is not requested, it's demanded. And tonight, Rick would pay the price. The weight of Mercer's words didn't hit Rick all at once. At first, they hung in the fog like a warning unheeded, calm, measured, and terrifyingly certain. But as Mercer walked away, coat swaying in the cold air, and the crowd slowly dispersed in a stunned, whispering silence, the realization began to creep in. Rick wasn't in trouble. He was in ruin. That night, Rick returned to his hotel, muttering curses under his breath, trying to laugh off the encounter to himself. But something had shifted. The adrenaline was gone. The bourbon was fading. And in its place, a dull, growing fear began to take root. By morning, it wasn't just a bad memory. It was everywhere. Footage of the incident, grainy but damning, had gone viral. Tourists had captured every second, the slurred insults, the tearing of the guard's uniform, the spit, the silence, the captain. Headlines exploded across British media before Rick even woke up. American tourist disrespects Royal Guard. Disgrace at Buckingham. Texan tears uniform. Spits at soldier. Captain Mercer steps in. An institution defends its own. What had been, in Rick's drunken mind, a throwaway moment of bravado, had now become an international scandal. Within 24 hours, the fallout began. He was arrested, not by some overzealous officer, but by an official from the Royal Constabulary, who treated the case with a level of formality usually reserved for national threats. He was charged with public disorder, assault, and intentional disrespect of a sovereign symbol. His passport was seized. his rights explained with cool British precision. And suddenly Rick Dalton wasn't just a tourist anymore, he was a cautionary tale. But the legal system wasn't the end of it. Captain Mercer, true to his word, had pulled every string available. Not to break Rick, but to make him an example. Behind the scenes, calls were made, embassies were looped in. Names were passed along to media outlets. Lawyers refused to represent him. His employer in Dallas received word through international press. He was fired by noon. Sponsors pulled out of his side businesses. His LinkedIn became a war zone of insults and screenshots. His inbox filled with death threats and ridicule, and worst of all, he was banned from re-entering the United Kingdom for life. His name, once unknown, was now infamous, not for fame or greatness, but for the disgrace of one thoughtless, drunken act. Sitting alone in a cold detention cell, Rick had nothing left to say, no audience. No bravado, just the ticking of a clock and the echo of a uniform being torn. He realized then, it wasn't the guard that destroyed him. It was the system behind that silence, centuries of honor wrapped in one red coat, and the man who had quietly said, "You've made your life much harder than it had to be," wasn't bluffing, but punishment was never the true ending. It was what came after, the silence, the stillness, the reckoning, that truly broke him. Rick Dalton sat alone in a sterile British detention center, the cold from the concrete floor slowly creeping into his bones. The cell wasn't violent. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost too quiet. And in that quiet, reality finally caught up with him. For the first time, without whiskey clouding his thoughts or adrenaline fueling his pride, he saw the entire night play back in merciless clarity. The torn cloth. The spit. The unwavering eyes of a soldier who said nothing, and yet said everything. He didn't just assault a man. He assaulted meaning, because that uniform wasn't just fabric, it was sacrifice. Discipline. It was the silent agreement of thousands who had stood in rain, war, and ceremony, never asking for applause, only for respect, and Rick had spat on it. The consequences were brutal, yes, legal, public, personal, but what crushed him now wasn't the media or Mercer or the law. It was the slow, unbearable realization that he had become the villain in someone else's story, and not just someone. An entire nation watched, a tradition watched, and worse, so did his own reflection. He thought back to Mercer's words, so calm, so chilling. "You have no idea what you've done." Now he did. He had grown up in a culture that prized boldness, where speaking louder often meant winning, where confidence was mistaken for character. But here, in the land of silent sentries and ancient rituals, he learned something else entirely. Silence can be sacred. And restraint? That's not weakness, it's power, sharpened by choice. Aaron Fletcher never fought back. But the system behind him did, with elegance, precision, and patience that no outburst could ever overcome. Rick stared at the wall, once blank and unremarkable. Now it felt like a mirror. He remembered how proud he had been to film his antics, thinking he was making content. Now, those same clips were evidence. Proof of a moment that cost him his job, his future, his dignity. But beneath the regret, beneath the shame, something else stirred. Understanding. Late, yes, but real. He began to see that honor wasn't flashy. It didn't scream for attention. It stood still in the cold, unmoved by taunts, loyal to something bigger than ego. And that was manhood. Not the kind he had learned in bars and ball games, but the kind passed down through silence, service, and stillness. If there was one thing Rick Dalton had left, it was the memory. And in that memory, the image that haunted him most wasn't Mercer's warning or the camera flashes. It was a single look. Aaron Fletcher standing still, face wet with spit, eyes unwavering, posture intact. That image said everything. And it would never leave him. But even in disgrace, a story doesn't truly end. Because sometimes it's not the punishment that defines a man, but what he sees in the aftermath. For Rick Dalton, that cold prison cell became more than just confinement. It became a crucible. The man who had entered London full of swagger, leather boots, and southern bravado was gone. In his place sat someone quieter, smaller, more aware, not broken, but stripped bare. And in that raw, unfiltered state, the true lesson began to take shape. It wasn't just about what he had done, it was about what he had misunderstood. Rick had grown up believing that power was loud. That respect had to be earned through dominance, through voice, through visibility. But what he encountered in London, on that fog-drenched square, in front of a silent guard and a watching captain, was a different kind of power, a deeper one. Power that doesn't flinch, power that doesn't need to yell, power that stands perfectly still, even in the face of humiliation. Because true strength isn't proven by reaction, it's measured by restraint. Aaron Fletcher, the young soldier Rick had taunted, never raised a hand. He never broke protocol. He didn't even speak. And yet, he won. He won not by overpowering Rick, but by standing for something Rick had never taken the time to understand. Principle. That's the thing about honor. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't bend to entertainment, and when you spit on it, you don't just insult a man. You awaken the entire legacy that man represents. Rick didn't lose everything because of a mistake. He lost everything because he mocked something sacred, and did it while believing he was untouchable. But no one is untouchable. Not in a world where reputation is fragile, where cameras are always watching, and where entire nations can rise to defend an ideal. What Rick learned, too late, is that when you laugh at dignity, dignity doesn't laugh back. It responds with silence, consequence, and memory. Now, as he sat in that tiny cell, watching the final hours of his detainment tick by, he realized something chilling. He would leave this place eventually. But the story would stay. His name had become a headline, his actions a warning, his downfall a case study in modern arrogance. And somewhere in the background of that viral video, frozen in digital permanence, was a still image, a soldier, standing tall, face damp, unshaken. That image would live longer than Rick's apology. And as the cell door finally creaked open behind him, the lesson followed close behind. You don't defeat tradition with noise. You don't bend discipline with mockery. And you never, ever mistake silence for weakness, because silence, when worn like a uniform, becomes unbreakable armor. Now that you've heard the full story, we want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Rick's shoes, or in Aaron's? This wasn't just a story about a tourist and a guard, it was about respect, restraint, and the silent power of tradition. Do you think Rick deserved the punishment he received? Was Captain Mercer right to make an example of him? And what does this moment say about how we, as a society, treat honor in a world obsessed with entertainment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Whether you agree, disagree, or feel torn, your perspective matters. And we read every single one. Also, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing this community grow across countries and cultures. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you reflect, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because tomorrow we'll be back with another untold story that just might change the way you see the world. We'll see you then.